Discovery class, good morning. I want to tell you the tale of why me. To begin with, right across the street is the University of Calgary. Big campus. When I came here as a pastor many years ago, they had only 2,000 or 3,000 students. Now they've got 40,000. There was a man over there that headed up religious studies. His name was Peter Craigie. He came from Scotland. Peter Craigie was the head of religious studies, and his field of study and his background as a student was ancient Near Eastern studies, the same as mine. I asked Peter if I could attend his classes and just sit in as an auditor, just audit the class, sit in the back, don't say anything, don't put your hand up, just listen. And I did. And we became good friends. I'm going to tell you the story of Peter and his best friend because it's going to be my introduction to my topic today, which is why me? You may not know it, but there's a book in the Bible in the ancient times, in the Old Testament Hebrew, that has a name, but it could have been called Why Me? We'll get to that in a bit. Dr. Peter Craigie grew up in Scotland, and he had a very close friend. And the two of them were about the same age, and they went to university together. And they both studied theology, but Peter's was deeper. He went into ancient Near Eastern studies, which was the study of architecture and growth and education and philosophy in the ancient world. And when Peter got his job at the university, if there was ever a discovery made in Iran, Iraq, Egypt, Middle East, maybe in Israel, his phone would ring. Now, this is before the internet. And they would send him pictures of what they found. It could be a cuneiform, maybe it was a piece of pottery, but on it would be writings. Peter was very adept in 8 Ugaritic languages. He could read what was on that piece of pottery and tell the reader what it meant. Anyway, here's Peter. He's studying over in Scotland, and his best friend, and there they are studying together. His best friend is going to be a pastor, a vicar in the Anglican Church. Now, right behind them, in another dormitory, are 2 ladies, their age, and they're the best of friends. And their studies are medicine. Both those girls are going to become doctors. Well, would you have it? Peter fell in love with one. His friend fell in love with the other one. And after they graduated, Peter stood up with his best friend to get married. And he stood up with Peter, his best friend, to also get married. And they both married doctors. Now, his friend stayed in the UK. Peter and his wife, they moved to Canada. They both had 2 children. That one had a boy and a girl. This one here had a boy and a girl. Peter's friend spent 4 years sort of apprenticing under a famous pastor in Britain. And then he decided to go out on his own, and he got his own church. One day he was visiting the hospital, one of his sick, and on the way home he had a tragic accident. They rushed him to the hospital in a coma. Class, he never came out of that coma. He died within 3 days of that terrible accident. Peter, living in Canada, got the phone call from the widow. And the widow told the tale. But really, the story in that phone call was, tell me. We had everything going for us. We had our whole future ahead of us. We had our children. We had our job. We had our friends. We had our home. Peter, my husband is gone. I'm a widow. Why me? Now move the clock ahead 5 years. I'm still here at Brentview, and I get a phone call that Peter and his family have had a terrible accident out here in the mountains, in the Rocky Mountains. Peter is rushed to the Foothills Hospital. It's right behind me, down here about 10 blocks. Tall hospital. It's got 10 floors. Peter was rushed to that hospital in a coma. I visited Peter for not one day, not two, but 10 straight days. I would go up that elevator and I would sit at Peter's side and I'd say, Peter, it's Ron. And I'd pinch his toe. And I'd say, Peter, it's almost time to go to work. You got to wake up. Come on. Class, he never woke up. Like his friend, 10 days after that tragic accident, Peter Craigie died. Very private funeral. I was invited because I knew his assistant. He's buried out here on the hill at Cochrane in our tiny cemetery. I went to the reception after the funeral at his house, and his wife went out into the backyard by herself, and I went out with her. And she said to me, almost the same words as his doctor friend over in England had said to the two of them. I have 2 children. We have a wonderful job. We have a wonderful home. We have the whole world at our tail. Peter is gone. Ron, can you tell me, why me? Discovery class, that book that I'm going to describe in the Old Testament that really should be called Why Me is called the Book of Job. It's 42 chapters long, and the whole theme all the way through is suffering. And when you read it, it's amazing because there are only 2 characters in the whole book that really make sense. One is Job, and the other is God. And this is what the whole book is about. Job and God, and that question, why me? Job had material things. He had a family. He had a wonderful personal health. But in the midst of all of that, he lost it. And that's really the theme of the book. But in the process, all the way through, as you read every chapter, is, why me? How come it was all taken away from me? Now, Job also, in his suffering, had 4 friends, and they show up in the book. Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and Elihu. Now, these are not dummies. These are all educated individuals that have come into his life in the book of Job. And they're teachers. One's a philosopher. One you'd call probably a psychiatrist. And in the midst of all his suffering, they're asking Job, hey boy, you know why this is happening to you, don't you? Job said, no, I don't. And they try to tell him why. And as you read the book, you're going to find that Job is a bit of a trailblazer. And you're going to see that the man has courage. He's full of integrity. And there seems to be a bit of an order to what he does because there's suffering and he's praying, and then he ends up worshiping. Now, the book of Job in the Old Testament is part of 3 other major books. And you know what they are? One is the book of Ecclesiastes. The other is the book of Proverbs. And the third one is the book of Job. And they are called the wisdom literature of the old ancient Hebrew Bible. Now, the theme in this book, as I told you, is suffering. And it's a man who's going to have an encounter with God. And as he watches and sees what comes unloading here, you're going to learn something about the inner workings of God's behavior. You're going to read as you go through this story that the book of Job is not a book on theory. And it's not a textbook. You don't read the book of Job as a textbook how to handle suffering. Better, it's a practical book. And it's a book that really deals with a man's experience more than his theory. Because you can almost enter right into how this man is behaving in the midst of the darkest period in his life's existence. Now, how do you counsel people that have hurt, or are being hurt, or have been hurt? Let's make up a story. Let's say you're a mother, and you have a child that's born to you, and that child has cerebral palsy. That child is never going to walk again. Half of his life is over before he even started. His whole life is going to be in a wheelchair. Are you prepared to handle that? Are you going to have a nursing home on your pants all the days of your life, and you're going to be virtually a nurse or a nursemaid? How would you explain that? Or if your friends came to you and say, why me? Have you ever asked yourself that? We have a lawyer in our church that I highly respect. Good man. Brilliant man. His practice is, if you went to court and you'd had an accident, he would represent you in that accident. He's really an accident lawyer. I asked him one day, I said, would you like to become a judge here in our province of Alberta? He said, yes, I would. I've applied twice. I said, well, why were you turned down? Well, he said, it wasn't because of my credentials. In our city of Calgary, I know most of the judges. I know most of my lawyer colleagues. There are 400 lawyers in the city of Calgary. I know most of them. Well, I said, why were you chosen as a judge to leave your practice and look after the jurisprudence of all these other things that come in? He said, I have a flaw. Well, I said, what would your flaw be that would hold you back? He said, I don't believe in abortion. I said, well, what's that got to do with the judge? Everything. He said, I have a child that has Down syndrome. And when that child was in its womb of my wife, we were told that. We knew that we were going to have a child that was going to be handicapped. And we had to make some choices, but it wasn't hard for me because I don't have any choice within my makeup that would say I would destroy a child because it's deformed or it doesn't have a right start because it's born handicapped. But those that chose me or would choose me to be a lawyer, judge, said, no, we don't want somebody on the court system that believes that a child's rights are a God-given gift. We don't believe that. So as a result, he was never chosen, nor will he ever be chosen to become a judge within our system of the courts. Does that stop me from respecting that judge and that would-be judge rather and that lawyer in our congregation? Not in your life. There's no greater lawyer in the whole city than that man that's in our congregation. All right, let's go to the story. Here it begins. Job was a man who lived in the land of Uz. It says in the first chapter, he was honest inside and out, just like my lawyer friend. He was a man of his word, totally devoted to his God, hated evil, had 7 sons and 3 daughters. Very wealthy. He had 7,000 sheep. It says he had 3,000 camels, 500 teams of oxen, 500 donkeys, and he had a huge staff. I suppose, as I read it, he'd be the wealthiest and influential man in the whole Middle East. If a man had a camel back in that day, do you know what he had, class? We would call it a Chevrolet. It was the most common General Motors product that anyone could buy because it was very affordable. Well, the Bible says that Job had 3,000 Chevrolets. And the reason they were so practical as a vehicle is because that's how they were transported. That was the transportation. They'd ride the donkey, or rather the camel and the donkey. But the camel was more than that. When it defecated, they would take its droppings, dry it out, and it became their woodpile. That's what kept them warm at night with their fire. That's what they stoked it with. Now, the lady of the house would milk the female camel because that became their dairy queen. Very, very practical. That's why it was a Chevrolet. And then, when they would slaughter a camel, it became their boots, it became their clothes, and it became their tent. You couldn't get enough Chevrolets back in that society. Well, here was Job. He had 3,000 of them. Now, he had a wonderful habit. Each morning, he'd get up early and he'd offer a burnt offering for each of his children. You'd say, what? Wonder why he do that? Well, maybe because one of them had sinned and they had defied their God inwardly. And Job made a habit to sacrifice. He made an atonement, one of his animals. And he would say, how is it, just in case one of my family sinned, I want them to know before God that they can be forgiven. That's the man we're talking about in the book of Job. You can't explain suffering, class. I'm an old pastor. I've been at it a long time. I can't explain suffering very well. I don't know why. Some people can explain it very easily, like these four philosophers. I can't. Now, Job was a good man. Very good man. I just told you. However, in the midst of him being a good man, something terrible happens. The scene switches from Job down on earth to a courtroom up in heaven. And there's a conversation in that courtroom. Two characters. God on one hand, Satan the adversary on the other hand. Now, Job doesn't know a thing about this. If he did, he would find it so much easier when he knows what's coming down the pike. Here's what Satan says to God. He says, no wonder this man Job that you have down on earth worships and follows you. Anybody would. Look at what you've given him. He's got all that land. He's got all that prosperity. Why wouldn't he follow you? It'd be like you and I today saying, well, why wouldn't you go to church? You own 3 Cadillacs? You own 3 cottages? We're living in a cold climate in Canada. We own something down in Palm Springs. We go down and golf for 4 or 5 weeks during the winter. We got season's tickets to the Flames. Why wouldn't I follow you? I'd love to go to church. And then the conversation switches. Satan says, let me take some of that away. And then we'll see who this one of yours called Job worships. We're just going to take it off. So, from about chapter 3 on down to about chapter 40, there's 42 chapters, he's going to have everything taken away, one by one. Bad messengers are going to come and they're going to say, Job, they've attacked your cattle, they're all dead. Job, comes the second messenger. Job, the enemy's come over the hill and they've killed all your sheep. Third messenger comes in. Job, all your Chevrolets are gone. All those 3,000 camel are dead. Job, I don't have any good news for you. And then finally it switches back up to heaven. And here's God, and here's Satan. And Satan says, all right, I can see he went through the first round. He didn't curse you. You took all that material away. Tell you what, I'm going to touch his body. Then watch him squirm, and he's going to curse you. God said, all right, go ahead. So he gives him leprosy, and he gives him boils. And he has boils all over his body. And they're horrible. He has no medication. There's no drugstore. There's no doctor that'll cure that. And there he is, so down, that he pulls the ashes out of the stove and he makes a heap and he sits on it. And on those ash heaps, along comes his wife and says, I've been watching you. I didn't mind you losing all the sheep and all the cattle and all the donkeys. But when they sent that messenger, said there was a storm and the house blew down and all our 10 children were killed, that's the end of it for me. I gave you these children. Your God's taken them all away now. And you want me to say something nice to you? Here are my words, Job. Why don't you curse God and die? That's in the book. And then from those words, all the way through to the tail end of the book, come these 4 messengers, these philosophers, and they say, Job, it's easy to explain. You sinned. And God's out to get you. And you're not going to survive. And you're going to endure the pain just like all of us do. And there's going to be no explanation. So have you not figured that out yet, Job? Now, all the way through the book, each one of these philosophers sort of sets up a problem for Job, and he has to try and solve it. Chapter 4, all through chapter 38. All the friends come in, and then finally the 4th friend comes in, and then he sort of adds the conclusion to what the other 3 have said. Do you know, in the midst of all of this, Job still remains a champion. He doesn't squirm. He doesn't wiggle from what he is, and he doesn't curse God and shame himself and blame God for anything that's happened. All right. Now suddenly, at the tail end of the book, it all changes. Finally, Job comes and he says, all right, God, I've talked to my wife. I've talked to these 4 friends. Will you let me talk to you? And God said, all right, talk to me. He says to God, Lord, I'm a changed person. I've lost everything you've given me. I know I've had problems, but I've done the best I can to serve you. Now, please, could you explain to me what's going on here? Now, God doesn't give an explanation. He gives Job a demonstration. Now, what do I mean by that? He says, Job, come with me. One of the best descriptions of creation in the entire Bible are those last 2 or 3 chapters of the book of Job. And beginning at the little things, God springs everything forth in his creation. He said, Job, Have you taken a look at the hippopotamus? Do you know who made that? And old Job listens. Job, have you looked in the sea and seen Leviathan? That great fish of the deep? Do you know who made that? Job doesn't say a word. Job, have you gone out on a starry night and taken a look up at my heavens? Have you seen the Milky Way? Did you see the North Star? Who do you think put it there? Job, have you noticed the snow on the mountain peak? And the sun comes up and the water melts and down it comes and it forms the sea. But the sea never rises. And this happens year after year after year. Have you not noticed, Job, what I've done? And here's Job listening. And he doesn't say a word. Class, are you aware that Job in the Old Testament is Jesus Christ in the New Testament? Do you see any parallel at all between what Job went through and what Jesus went through? Now remember, Jesus was divine. He was God. Satan tempted him and said, would you follow me? And even on the night that he was betrayed, do you remember in the garden? He said, Father, if it be your will, would you take this cup from me? Do I really have to go through with this thing called the cross? And then on the cross, do you remember his words? Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. Isn't that gorgeous? In other words, what Job couldn't explain, God himself doesn't explain. And he's going through it. And he became my sacrifice. That's why I like the book of Job. The book of Job has so much meaning. I go back to it again and again. And you know, the funny thing is, the older I get, the more I read it. The book of Job is really not for young people, although they should read it and understand it. But the older we get, the better it becomes. I have a friend of mine. She's 91 years of age. She's a returned missionary from Japan. She spent 30 years over there serving the Lord. When she was a little girl growing up here in the prairies, there were 3 in the family. She had a sister and a brother. But it was called the Dirty 30s for a reason. It was dark, dreary, and they were on a farm, not far from here. And one night, when the baby was born, her little brother, in the morning they went out and they couldn't find her. And you know what Mother had done? She had gone down to the slough and she'd taken that little baby. And together they went down under the water and they were drowned. She'd had enough. She couldn't take any more. Well, my friend, 91-year-old returned missionary, she and her sister were raised by an aunt and an uncle. And then as she got older, she became a nurse, she became a Christian, she met her husband, and off they went to missions over in Japan for 30 years. And while they were there, they had 3 girls. They went off to a Christian school. And every one of those girls were molested by teachers in that Christian school. And it changed their whole life. Anyway, the husband, he comes in with cancer. And back home to Canada they come. He dies. That missionary had to raise those 3 daughters, and she did an admirable job. One has now died because of diabetes. And the other one married a Japanese man. He's living back over there. And the other one is here. I said to her on the phone recently, I said, telling this story coming up, did you ever think of saying, why me? She said, no. She said, no, I have never said, why me? Though he slay me, yet will I love him. Those have become the words that I follow, just like Job's. And that's where I sit now. And you know, I could tell by her voice, and I could tell by her demeanor, and I could tell by her attitude, she meant everything she said. Okay, that's enough. I see the clock on the wall is gone, and I've gone past my time. Give you a smile for the sunny side of the street. When I was a kid going to school, one day the teacher said to me, I don't know what class it was, I think I was 5 or 6. She said to me, Ronnie, and they called me all Ronnie in the class, Ronnie, can you tell me, whereabouts are your bowels? And I just stared at her. Can you tell me where they are, Ronnie? Finally, I said, no, I can't. Well, why not? My mother's always giving me something to make them move. See you next week, class. Thank you for joining me today. If you come back next week, I'm going to give you another one of those great old books of the Old Testament called the Books of Wisdom. I'm going to give you a hint at the book of Ecclesiastes. Come and hear it.